In the bitter winter of 1887, while the other homesteaders in the valley stacked cordwood high and sealed every draft with mud and straw, Susan Morrow was doing the opposite. She was shoveling snow directly against her cabin walls, packing it tight like a trapper taught her, until her home looked buried alive. Neighbors rode past and shook their heads, calling it madness to embrace the very thing that killed. But Susan knew a secret about snow that most settlers never learned. And when the killing cold finally arrived, the truth would save not just her family, but the coldest building in the whole village. This section is formatted for direct paste into VidRush custom script mode. Susan Morrow was a 29-year-old widow, the schoolteacher for the scattered homesteads of the valley, and the keeper of a desperate secret. 2 winters earlier, she had buried her husband after a blizzard took him barely 100 yards from their door. The cold was not a stranger to her. It was an enemy that had already stolen everything. So when she began packing snow against her walls like a trapper had once shown her, the villagers looked away in pity. They thought grief had twisted her reason, but Susan wasn't grieving anymore. She was preparing for a winter the old-timers whispered about in low voices, a killing cold that would test every building in the settlement. And the place that needed saving most wasn't even her own cabin. It was the drafty schoolhouse where the valley's children would soon be trapped with nothing but a thin stove and a wind that cut through logs like a knife. The question that winter was simple. Could the very thing that had widowed her now become the only thing standing between those children and a frozen grave? She had learned the secret from a trapper named Joseph Blake, a French-Canadian mountain man who had spent 20 winters living alone in the high passes of the Absarokas. Joseph had no cabin, only a lean-to and a fire that barely survived the wind. Yet he told Susan he had never lost a toe to the cold. The trick, he said, was snow. Not fighting it, but using it. Pack it thick against your shelter, and the cold will forget how to find you. At the time, Susan had thought he was simply an old man with too many stories. But after the blizzard of 1885, after she watched her husband Stephen freeze to death in a storm that swallowed his voice and his footprints, those words returned to her like a ghost she could no longer ignore. The winter of 1887 began its warning early. The summer that year had been short and strange. Birds left the valley 3 weeks sooner than anyone could remember. The aspen trees turned gold in August instead of September. Then in October, the first hard frost arrived with a silence that felt wrong even to the oldest settlers. People in the valley began to prepare in the only ways they knew. Men hauled extra cords of pine and fir down from the ridges. Women stuffed rags into every crack and layered straw against the north walls. The wiser homesteaders built heavy snow fences 20 yards out from their barns, designed to catch the drifting powder before it buried their doors. There was a rhythm to survival that had been passed down from generations who had learned through loss. But Susan Morrow had learned through loss something entirely different. She lived in a small 2-room cabin at the edge of the settlement, a place Stephen had built with his own hands before their son was born. The boy, James, was now 6 years old. Together, they were all that remained of a family that had once planned to fill those rooms with laughter. In the early days of November, when the first light snow dusted the valley floor, Susan did not reach for a broom to sweep it away. Instead, she walked to the woodpile, grabbed a grain shovel, and began carrying load after load of snow toward her cabin. She packed it against the base logs, tamping it down with the flat of the blade, building a wall of dense white 2 feet thick. Then she did the same on the north wall, then the west. Neighbors returning from the trading post stopped their wagons and stared. Some called out to her, asking if she had lost her reason. Susan did not answer. Day after day, the snow wall grew higher until half her cabin looked as though it were slowly being reclaimed by winter itself. But Susan Morrow was not building a wall. She was building a blanket. Joseph Blake had explained it to her in a fur trader's shack 3 years earlier, drawing lines in the dust with a stick. Dry, loose snow was full of air pockets, he said. Air trapped in tiny spaces could not move. It became a barrier, like the thick wool of a buffalo coat. The trick was packing it just enough to make it dense, but not so much that you crushed the air out. A properly built snowbank could hold a cabin at nearly 40 degrees, even when the outside wind screamed at 30 below. Susan had listened politely, but never imagined she would one day stake her life and her son's life on that dusty diagram. The villagers did not share her faith. The loudest critic was a man named Elias Carver, a thick-shouldered farmer who owned the largest grain operation in the valley and served as chairman of the town's small five-man council. Carver had spent 6 winters on the plains and believed with absolute certainty that snow was a thing to be cleared, not embraced. He came to Susan's cabin one afternoon while she was shoveling, his breath clouding in the cold air. "You're going to suffocate your stove," he said. "That snow will melt, refreeze into ice against the logs, and rot the wood before spring. You'll be sleeping in a frozen ruin." Susan kept shoveling. Carver shook his head and walked away, muttering that the widow Morrow had finally cracked under the weight of her grief. His words spread through the valley, hardening into judgment before the first deep snow even arrived. The crisis, however, was not at Susan's cabin. It was 100 yards down the frozen path, inside a single-room building with a leaky roof and walls so poorly chinked that the wind slipped through like an invisible blade. The valley schoolhouse had been built 8 years earlier with donated wood and volunteer labor, which meant it had been built cheaply. The stove was an old iron potbelly that cracked and ate through cords of fuel. The windows were single-layered and warped. Every winter, the teacher had to stop lessons mid-morning and march the children in circles just to keep their feet from numbing. This winter, Susan was no longer merely the teacher's neighbor. She was the teacher. By late November, a deeper cold had settled over the valley, the kind that stayed all day and bit harder at night. The sky turned pale and flat. Susan knew what was coming. The old-timers had been saying it for months: a killing winter, the worst in a decade. The schoolhouse would become a death trap if nothing changed. She approached the town council with a request: allow her to bank snow around the schoolhouse, the same method she was using at her cabin. She would do all the labor herself. She asked for nothing but permission. The council listened in silence. Then Carver spoke. He said the schoolhouse was public property, not a widow's experimental farm. He said no child's education would be funded by the madness of a grieving woman. He said no. The vote was unanimous. That night, after James was asleep and the moon had risen high over the frozen valley, Susan pulled on her heavy wool coat and walked through the darkness to the schoolhouse. She carried the grain shovel over her shoulder and a lantern hooked to her belt. The wind was already sharp enough to sting her cheeks, and the snow crunched beneath her boots with a sound that was both familiar and final. She began to dig. She packed the first snow against the north wall, then the east, then the west, building a thick, compacted berm that rose nearly 4 feet high. She worked until her shoulders screamed and her fingers went numb inside her mittens. She knew what she was risking. If the council discovered her defiance, she could lose her position, her income, perhaps even the respect of the community she was trying to save. But the only thing that frightened her more than public ruin was hearing the voices of children pleading for warmth in a room that had none. A week later, on the 3rd morning of December, the temperature dropped so sharply that water thrown from a bucket froze before it hit the ground. That was the day the killing cold finally arrived. The wind came down from the mountains like something alive and furious, driving a wall of white across the valley. The schoolhouse groaned under the assault. Inside, the potbelly stove glowed red, but the heat vanished 2 feet from the iron. The children huddled together, their breath forming clouds. Susan stood at the window, watching the blizzard pile drifts against the outer walls of the valley. But here, inside this fragile room, she could feel the difference. The north wall was no longer a sieve. The snow packed against the logs outside had become a shield, holding the warmth inside like a secret. The storm was still screaming, but the killing edge was gone. Yet the true test was not the schoolhouse. It was the village itself. As the blizzard intensified, the roofs of barns collapsed under drifting weight. Chimneys cracked. A man named Timothy Burns froze his fingers trying to reach his woodpile in whiteout conditions. And Elias Carver, the man who had mocked Susan the loudest, found his own house buried to the roofline because he had built his snow fence too close. Inside his parlor, with the fire dying and his children crying, he finally understood that the enemy was not the snow itself. It was thinking you could outfight it. By the time the storm began to ease on the fourth day, the valley had learned a brutal lesson. The only building that had stayed warm through the worst of it was the one everyone had called a fool's experiment. But Susan Morrow was not finished yet. The killing cold had only just begun. This section is formatted for direct paste into VidRush custom script mode. When dawn finally broke over the valley on the fifth day, it revealed a world that had been reshaped by violence. The wind had died to a whisper, but the cold pressed down with full weight. Entire fence lines had vanished beneath smooth waves of white. Timothy Burns was digging out his barn with hands still wrapped in bloody bandages. 2 roofs had collapsed overnight on the north end of town. And Elias Carver's grain barn, the symbol of his prosperity, now leaned at a sick angle, its ridge beam cracked like a broken spine. But Susan Morrow's cabin stood with its snow walls intact, smoke curling from the chimney in a thin, steady column. And the schoolhouse, the drafty little room the council had deemed hopeless, had not lost a single window pane. No drift had forced the door. Inside, the iron stove still held warmth from the night before, and the packed snow against the logs had frozen into a solid white armor. Elias Carver did not come to the schoolhouse that morning. He sent his wife, Martha, instead. She arrived with a wool scarf pulled tight around her face, and a basket of cornbread she said was for the children, though her eyes told a different story. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the bare patches on the inner walls where frost normally gathered, the way the cold air did not press through the chinking as it did in every other building she had visited. "Is it really just the snow?" she asked. Susan nodded. "Packed tight enough to hold the air still. That's all." Martha looked toward her own house, barely visible across the drifted fields, where her husband was now chipping ice from the foundation timbers with a broken axe handle. Her jaw tightened. Then she turned and walked back through the snow without another word. But the cornbread stayed. Over the next 2 days, something shifted in the valley. It was not yet belief, not the kind of open admission that would cost a proud man his standing. It was quieter, a curiosity. A husband who had laughed at Susan now asked his wife if she remembered how thick the snowbank was against the schoolhouse. A farmer who had voted with Carver now walked the long way around Susan's property in the evenings, pretending to check his traps but really measuring the height of her snow wall with his eyes. The change did not announce itself. It crept in through frozen door cracks and half-shoveled paths. But it was there, and Susan felt it like a shift in the wind. That was when the second warning arrived, though not from any human voice. The sky turned a strange shade of gray-green on the 7th day, a color the old-timers called a butcher's apron. The temperature, which had hovered near 10 below, suddenly plummeted to 30 below by noon. Frost formed on the inside of Susan's window glass while the stove was still burning. Snow that had been soft enough to dig now hardened into a crust that could cut a man's hand. James coughed that night in his sleep, a dry, rasping sound that made Susan's heart go cold. She pressed her palm to his forehead and found it hotter than the stove iron. By morning, the cough had deepened into something that rattled in his chest, and the schoolhouse would have to wait, because the only thing that mattered now was keeping her son alive. The news spread quickly through the valley. A widowed schoolteacher, alone in a frozen cabin with a sick child, no doctor within 30 miles and no trail open for a wagon. Women arrived with remedies: onion poultices, hot mustard plasters, elderberry syrups that had been sealed in cellars since the fall. They whispered instructions and pressed jars into Susan's hands, then hurried back to their own homes before the cold found them. But the one person who did not come was the one she needed most. Joseph Blake, the old trapper who had first told her about the snow, had not been seen in the valley since autumn. He was somewhere in the high country, and no one knew if he was even alive. So Susan sat alone with her sick boy, feeding the stove every hour, watching the snow walls outside hold the heat inside like a promise she desperately needed to keep. Then, on the 3rd night of James's fever, when the cold outside reached 42 below and the cabin walls groaned like a ship in rough seas, The door swung open without a knock. Elias Carver stood in the doorway, his beard white with frost and his eyes hollow. Behind him stood two of his farmhands, dragging a sled loaded with split oak, the dense, slow-burning wood that most men hoarded for their own hearths. "My wife says your boy needs this more than we do," Carver said. He did not apologize. He did not say he had been wrong. But he set the wood inside the cabin himself, stack after stack, until Susan's fuel pile was higher than it had been all winter. Then he turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "The council will meet tomorrow," he said, not looking back. "We'll talk about banking the schoolhouse for the next storm." Then he was gone into the dark, leaving only cold footprints and the heavy scent of oak. James's fever broke on the fifth night, just as the butcher's aproned sky began to clear. Susan wept silently beside his bed, her body finally releasing a tension she had held since the first cough. But outside, the valley was changing again. The crusted snow was softening under a rare warm wind from the south, a chinook that raised the temperature 30 degrees in a single afternoon. Streams of meltwater ran across the frozen ground, pooling around cabin foundations. For 2 days, the world seemed to breathe. And that was exactly what Susan feared most. Because when a winter thawed and then froze again, the ice would swell in every crack, splitting logs and shattering stone. The schoolhouse, with its poorly chinked walls, would become a sieve of frozen air. A thaw followed by a hard freeze was not a mercy. It was a trap, and the children would be walking straight into it. She went to the council meeting. The schoolhouse itself had been cleared of snow, its benches wiped down, and the potbelly stove sat cold in the center of the room like a silent judge. Every member of the five-man council was present, plus a dozen other heads of households who had no vote but plenty of opinion. Carver sat at the front, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Susan stood before them all and did not speak of the snow walls, not first. She spoke about the thaw. She explained that meltwater had soaked into the schoolhouse logs, that when the cold returned, the ice would wedge the walls apart, that the gaps would be worse than before, that the stove would burn double the wood and still the children would freeze. She said she could rebuild the snow banks, but she would need help because the thaw had collapsed her previous work. She would need hands and she would need trust. The room was silent for a long time after she finished. Then Elias Carver stood up. "You'll have my hands," he said, "and my son's." It was not an apology. It was surrender, but the cold did not give them time to celebrate. That same afternoon, while Susan and Carver's sons were packing the first fresh snow against the schoolhouse walls, a runner came down from the North Ridge. The Chinook had stalled. The temperature was dropping again, faster than anyone had ever recorded. A wall of black cloud was massed behind the peaks, and the wind was beginning to shift. The old-timer who had carried the message, a trapper named Samuel Holt who had been trapping in the high passes for 30 winters, looked Susan directly in the eye. "You've got maybe 6 hours," he said. "This one's going to break records. I've seen wind strip bark off a spruce like it was wet paper." He pointed at the schoolhouse. "Your snowbank's got to be higher than it was before, and it's got to hold against 50 below, not 30. If it fails, nobody in that building lasts the night." Then he turned and walked toward the general store because he had his own family to warn. Susan looked at the half-finished snow wall, then at the schoolhouse door where a dozen children would soon be arriving for lessons. The storm was coming, and the math had just changed entirely. This section is formatted for direct paste into VidRush custom script mode. Susan turned away from Samuel Holt and looked at the schoolhouse as though seeing it for the first time in raw, honest light. The building was not merely old. It was wounded. The Chinook had done more than soften the snow. Meltwater had run down the raw logs, soaked the dry chinking, and then frozen again when the temperature dropped at sundown. The logs had swollen and then contracted so fast that cracks snaked through the north wall. Some were wide enough to slide a knife blade through. And now a black sky was rolling down from the peaks, carrying cold that could shatter stone. She had 6 hours, maybe less, to turn this fragile little room into a shelter that could hold against a wind that had peeled bark from living spruce trees. Elias Carver's sons, William and Thomas, were already back at work, hauling fresh snow in grain buckets, their breath exploding in white plumes. Susan had explained the trapper's method in simple terms. Pack the snow not like a wall but like a blanket, dense enough to trap the air but not so hard that it became solid ice. The trick was in the rhythm. Shovel, tamp, layer, repeat. The snow had to rise at least 6 feet against the north wall, 4 against the east and west, and angle outward slightly at the base, so drifting snow would curl away from the door, not bury it. Susan had drawn a diagram in the snow with a stick, marking the critical angles, the drift lanes, the place where the wind would hit hardest. William watched her carefully. Thomas, younger and quicker, said nothing and worked. Other hands arrived without being called. Timothy Burns, his own barn still half collapsed, came with a shovel and 2 armloads of burlap sacks to cover the windows. A woman named Mary Hatch, who had lost a child to fever the previous winter and would not risk another, brought 3 wool blankets and a bucket of pitch to seal the worst cracks. Even Martha Carver appeared, carrying a pail of steaming broth and a lantern with a fresh wick. By 4 in the afternoon, the snow banks around the schoolhouse were taller than they had been before the thaw, but not tall enough. Not yet. The black cloud had swallowed the peaks and was now eating the sky. The wind began to stir in short, testing gusts that rattled the loose shingles on the roof. Susan measured the bank against the north wall with her eyes and then with her body, standing against it, the packed snow reaching just below her shoulders. It would have to be higher than her head by the time the storm struck. She signaled for more snow, and the boys kept digging. The problem was the snow itself. The Chinook had turned the upper crust into a slurry of ice grains and water. Now that the cold was returning, the top layer was freezing into a brittle shell. It did not pack the same way the dry, early winter powder had. It clumped, then crumbled. Susan could feel the difference in her shovel. Joseph Blake had told her once that the best snow for banking was the kind that fell in steady, windless cold, the light powder that squeaked underfoot. This snow was heavy, wet, and mean. She would have to work it harder, tamp it longer, pray the air pockets held. Then Thomas Carver shouted. He was standing near the northeast corner of the schoolhouse, pointing at a crack that ran from the foundation stones upward nearly 3 feet. It was not an old crack from the thaw. It was new, and it was widening. The ground beneath that corner had been poorly drained, and the freeze-thaw cycle had heaved a foundation stone out of alignment. The north wall was separating from the floor beams. Susan knelt beside it, thrust her hand into the gap, and felt the wind already whistling through from outside. This was not just a leak. It was a wound that would bleed heat into the storm until the room became a refrigerator. She had no time to rechink it, no lumber to brace it. All she could do was pack snow directly into the gap, pray it froze in place before the storm found it, and hope it would not melt from the inside warmth. By 5 o'clock, the children had begun to arrive, not because lessons were still scheduled, but because the storm was now so close that the schoolhouse had become the only refuge. Some had walked from outlying homesteads, their small faces half hidden by scarves stiff with breath frost. Others had been delivered by fathers who could not stay. Elias Carver himself arrived last, carrying a double armload of split pine and a heavy iron fireback he had taken from his own hearth to place behind the stove, to reflect more heat into the room. He did not speak, but he met Susan's eyes. The question was there, unspoken. Would this hold? Susan could only give him the truth. "We'll know in 3 hours," she said. The first full blast of the storm struck at exactly 5:47. It came not as a gradual rise, but as a single invisible hammer. The schoolhouse shuddered. The potbelly stove coughed smoke, then drew clean. Outside, the world vanished into a white roar so complete that the window became nothing but a gray-pale square, a chaos of flying ice. Inside, the children huddled on the benches, their small bodies pressed together. The youngest, a girl of 5 named Lottie, began to cry. Susan pulled her close, wrapped her in one of Mary Hatch's blankets, and began to speak. She did not tell them a story. She taught them a lesson. She told them about Joseph Blake, the old trapper who had lived through 20 high-country winters. She told them about the snow that wasn't a killer but a blanket, about the air trapped in tiny pockets, about why a packed bank could hold heat longer than stone. She spoke calmly, the same voice she used for arithmetic, and the children listened. Their crying stopped. A boy of 10, Samuel Holt's son, raised his hand and asked if they could help keep the warmth in. Susan thought for a moment, then pointed to the drift lane she had watched Parker Vail design in another winter in another story. She sent the older children to check the windows, pressing rolled rags into any crack that whistled. The younger ones were told to sit closer together, sharing warmth. She herself kept feeding the stove, measuring the wood carefully, watching the thermometer she had hung on the wall. The temperature inside was 38 degrees. It was not warm, but it was not yet fatal. Then the second blast hit and the temperature outside dropped to 54 below. The difference was not a number. It was a physical presence. The walls groaned and snapped. The snowbank outside the north wall, the critical one, began to crack horizontally. Susan saw it through the window, a dark line spreading across the packed surface like a fracture in lake ice. The gap in the foundation was pulling the snow apart. If the bank split open, the wind would claw through the hole and tear the room's heat away in minutes. Susan grabbed her coat and the shovel. She pushed the door open against the pressure, stepping into a white violence that took her breath away. The snow beneath her boots was hard as iron, but she climbed the bank, dropped to her knees, and began packing the crack by hand, stuffing fresh powder into the gap with her bare fingers. The cold burned like fire. Her mittens were already lost. She did not feel them go. Inside, the children watched the door swing wildly, the teacher vanish, the storm pour into the room. William Carver moved to close the door, but then he saw what she was doing, saw the dark crack threatening to split their shelter. He did not follow her, but he turned to the other children. "Everybody listen," he said, his voice cracking. "My father said snow holds air. The teacher's out there keeping the snow from breaking. We got to keep the air inside. Everybody find a crack. Stuff it with whatever you got." The children scrambled, stuffing their spare scarves, their extra mittens, torn pages from a slate tablet into every gap they could reach. The stove glowed redder. The temperature on the wall thermometer dipped to 32, then impossibly held steady. Susan worked the crack until the snow froze into a solid patch. Then she staggered back inside, her hands white and stiff. Martha Carver wrapped them in warm cloth and shoved them near the stove, while the wind screamed louder, as if enraged at being denied. For 2 hours, the schoolhouse hung in a bubble of still, warm air while the storm raged around it. The snowbanks, packed higher than before, shaped the wind upward over the roof. The drift lane angled from the door carried the snow sideways, preventing a deadly accumulation. And the many small hands inside had sealed so many leaks that the interior temperature actually began to rise. By 9 o'clock that night, the thermometer read 41 degrees. The children had stopped shivering. A few had even fallen asleep. Then at 10 minutes past midnight, the storm broke. Not gradually, but with a sudden, exhausted silence that was more shocking than the noise had been. The wind simply stopped. The white void outside cleared, revealing a sky choked with stars so bright they hurt to look at. The valley lay buried under a fresh mantle of powder so deep it erased every fence, every wagon track, every mark of human life. But inside the schoolhouse, the children were alive. All of them. And the building that had been the coldest in the village was now the warmest refuge for miles in any direction. The story of that night burned through the settlement faster than the frost. By the time the first traders pushed through the drifts a week later, word had already spread to neighboring valleys. A schoolteacher had saved a building full of children, not with fire, not with extra lumber, but with snow. The same enemy that had taken her husband had become her only ally. And the lesson she taught inside that fragile room had changed more than just one winter. It had planted an idea that would grow for decades, passed from child to child, from family to family, until the method of packing snow against walls became common practice in frontier settlements that had once called it madness. But Susan Morrow was not finished teaching yet. The killing cold of that winter would test them all again before the spring. And the deepest lesson was still waiting to be learned, not inside the schoolhouse, but at the small cabin at the edge of the valley, where a widowed teacher and her son would have to prove that the trapper's secret could save not just a building full of children, but a future. But Susan Morrow was not finished teaching yet. The killing cold of that winter would test them all again before the spring, and the deepest lesson was still waiting to be learned. Not inside the schoolhouse, but at the small cabin at the edge of the valley, where a widowed teacher and her son would have to prove that the trapper's secret could save not just a building full of children, but a future. The weeks that followed the great blizzard were not kind. The thaw that had preceded it was only a false promise. The cold locked down again with a grip that would not loosen, and the valley entered a period of stillness so deep it felt like a held breath. For Susan, the victory at the schoolhouse had been a single battle. The war was still the winter itself, and it was far from over. James, her son, had weathered the fever but remained thin and pale, his cheeks hollowed by the fight. The cabin required constant attention. The snow banks she had packed against its walls held firm, but the endless cold demanded more wood, more vigilance, more of everything a single mother could scrape from a frozen world. Each morning she would climb the packed berm to the roof and sweep the chimney clean, because a blocked flue in 50 below cold meant death by morning. Each night she would test the snow walls with a stick, probing for soft spots or cracks that the wind might exploit. The work had become a ritual, a form of prayer spoken in shovel strokes. Then, on the last day of January, a second storm rolled down from the mountains. It was not as violent as the blizzard that had tested the schoolhouse, but it was heavier. The snow fell wet and dense, the kind that sticks to branches and bends them until they snap. By morning, the valley had received nearly 3 feet of fresh accumulation. Drifts rose against every building, including Susan's cabin, but the packed snow banks, now frozen solid from weeks of cold, held their shape. The new snow layered over them like a fresh coat of paint, thickening the insulation. Outside, the temperature dropped again to 30 below. Inside the cabin, with the stove burning low, the air remained a steady 42 degrees. James sat by the fire, reading a worn primer, his breath no longer visible. That small number, 42 degrees, was the difference between misery and survival. Susan had learned to read that number like a clock, but the weight of the wet snow had consequences. Across the valley, roofs were failing. Elias Carver's grain barn, already damaged, finally collapsed completely under the load, burying half his winter feed. Timothy Burns lost a lean-to over his remaining livestock, and the schoolhouse, the fragile building that had become a symbol of defiance, began to show a new danger. The snowbanks Susan had packed so carefully now supported a drift that had climbed all the way to the roofline on the north side. The pressure was immense. If the log walls buckled inward, everything they had saved would be lost. Susan knew this because Joseph Blake had warned her 3 years earlier during that conversation in the trader's shack. He had drawn a second diagram, the one most people forgot. A snow bank could protect a wall, but it could also crush it if the load grew too heavy and too high. The trick was knowing when to remove some snow before it became a locomotive of frozen weight. She went to Carver. This time, there was no argument. The council had already voted after the blizzard to adopt Susan's methods for all public buildings, and Carver had personally thanked her, though the words had come out rough and unpracticed. Now, with the new storm pressing down, they gathered every available hand. Men who had once mocked her now took direction without question. They carved away the upper layers of the drift against the schoolhouse, reducing the pressure while leaving a thick blanket in place. They built angled snow walls 20 feet out to redirect future drift. They braced the roof beams with fresh timber. The work was no longer experimental. It was doctrine. And then, in the quiet that followed, the old trapper returned. Joseph Blake appeared at the edge of the valley on a bright, brittle afternoon in mid-February, leading a mule burdened with frozen pelts. He was gaunt and wind-scarred, having spent the winter in a high camp that no one believed could support life. But he was alive, and when he saw the snow-packed walls around Susan's cabin, he smiled for what might have been the first time in years. He stood in the cold, studying the work like a master inspecting a student's final piece. "You remembered the air," he said. "Most folks pack it too hard. They crush the air out and then it's just ice. Ice pulls heat out of logs faster than wind. You left it just dense enough." He looked toward the schoolhouse where the children were once again gathered for lessons and nodded slowly. "I told you snow wasn't your enemy. You listened." But then he told her something she had never heard before. He told her where he had learned it. Not from a trapper, not from a mountain man, but from a Lakota woman named White Heron during a winter he had spent stranded in the Powder River country 30 years earlier. She had showed him how her people built winter shelters, packing snow against hide and pole structures, shaping the drifts with deliberate intent. The technique was not a fur trapper's invention. It was indigenous knowledge, centuries older than any white settlement in the territory. Joseph had simply carried it into the high passes and adapted it for cabins. Susan listened in silence. The realization settled over her like a new layer of snow. She had been teaching a borrowed wisdom, one that had survived genocides and wars, preserved by people the frontier had tried to erase. That night, she wrote everything Joseph told her into a small ledger book, alongside her own observations, so the knowledge would not die with her. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came in a rush. The snow retreated, revealing grass already greening beneath. The schoolhouse stood intact, its logs dried and solid, its chinking needing fewer repairs than any spring in memory. Susan's cabin survived without a single cracked foundation stone. James grew stronger, his cough gone, his face filling out as the days warmed. The valley counted its losses. A few barns, a few fingers, one old man who had refused all help and been found frozen in his chair. But compared to the winter of 1885, when dozens had died, the scales had tipped. The snowbanks had not only saved the schoolhouse, they had saved the idea that the land itself could be an ally, not just an adversary. The surprising thing, however, was not the survival. It was what the children remembered. Years later, when some of those same pupils had grown into parents and farmers themselves, they recalled not just the blizzard or the cold, but the lessons Susan had taught them while the wind screamed. They remembered the trapped air, the drift lanes, the way a simple snowbank could turn a death trap into a refuge. And they taught their own children. The method spread quietly, without fanfare, carried by word of mouth through the territory. By the turn of the century, packing snow against north walls had become standard practice in settlements from the Dakotas to Montana. Few remembered the name Susan Morrow, but they all knew the trick. One evening in the fall of 1888, a year after the Great Killing Cold, Susan stood outside her cabin and looked at the schoolhouse. The logs had been whitewashed, the roof re-shingled, a new stove installed with a proper fireback. The building no longer looked like the coldest place in the village. It looked like a center of warmth. She turned and went inside where James was already asleep. On the table lay the ledger, the one with Joseph Blake's words and her own hand-drawn diagrams. She had filled 20 pages with measurements, weather notes, and instructions. The last line she had written that afternoon read, "Teach the children. The walls are nothing without the knowing." She closed the book, banked the fire for the night, and stepped into the quiet dark, where the first frost of autumn was already forming on the grass. Winter would come again. But this time, the valley would be ready. The winter of 1887 did not break the valley. It reshaped it. For decades afterward, the old-timers would tell the story of the widow who taught the children to survive by embracing the very thing everyone else feared. But the real lesson was larger than one woman, larger than one schoolhouse. It was a lesson about listening. The trapper Joseph Blake had listened to a Lakota woman named White Heron in the Powder River country. Susan Morrow had listened to Joseph. And the children, huddled in that drafty room while the wind screamed at 54 below, had listened to Susan. That chain of listening, stretching across cultures and generations, had turned a killer into a shield. The frontier was full of such knowledge, buried not because it was complex, but because it seemed wrong. Packing snow against a wall looked insane. Letting the cold embrace your home felt like surrender. But the people who survived the longest on the plains were rarely the strongest or the most stubborn. They were the ones willing to see the world differently. They recognized that a blizzard was not just a threat. It was also a material, a tool, a builder if you understood how it moved. And the most dangerous thing a person could do was to stop learning from the land itself. Susan Morrow's ledger, the one she filled with diagrams and weather notes, passed to her son James when he came of age. He became a carpenter, building homes with thicker north walls and angled snow breaks. He never forgot that winter. And when he had children of his own, he taught them the same lesson his mother had written on the last page. Teach the children. The walls are nothing without the knowing. Today, the valley looks different. The original schoolhouse is gone, replaced by a modern structure with central heating and insulated windows. The cabins have been rebuilt or abandoned, but the idea remains, woven into the fabric of cold weather survival. The principle that packed snow creates dead air, and dead air is the best insulation, is now standard knowledge for anyone who spends a winter in the backcountry. It appears in military manuals, in wilderness survival guides, in the practices of Arctic researchers. It was never madness. It was just waiting to be remembered. So the question that hangs over the story of Susan Morrow is not whether she was brilliant or lucky. It is the same question that settled over the Cannon Butte Basin after Parker Vale's Cedar Rings broke the storm. What else have we forgotten? What other wisdom lies beneath the surface of things, dismissed by people who refuse to look closely enough? The frontier was not won by muscle alone. It was won by observation. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon against winter was the winter itself. Subscribe now to uncover more stories of forgotten ingenuity, and join us as we dig through the pages of history that time almost erased. The next tale is already waiting, just beneath the snow.